Hello, and welcome to The Complete History of Science, Series 5, Episode 3, Nicolaus Copernicus, A More Reasonable Arrangement. Torun, the birthplace of Nicolaus Copernicus, was a rather unremarkable town in central Poland. Far from the great cities of Paris, Rome and Venice, it lay along the banks of the Vistula River, some 100 miles south of the Baltic Sea. However, it would have been unfair to call Torun a backwater. Trade along its river thrived, as the docks sent cloth, grain and wood down to the coast to be shipped across the continent. Copernicus's father Nikolai had moved to Torun from Krakow and had grown modestly wealthy as a merchant here. He married a local woman, Barbara Watson-Rode, and together they raised 4 children in a large brick house in the centre of the town. Nicolaus Copernicus was the youngest child, born on the 19th of February, 1473. We can be fairly precise about this date, as his horoscope has survived, which records his birth as exactly 4:48 p.m. on the Friday afternoon. As a youth, he would have been known as Nicolaus Copernic, named for his father, and the name only became Latinized to Copernicus when he went to university. Likely, at home, Nicolaus spoke German, but learned Latin at the local parish school St. John's. As a youth, life was comfortable and uneventful, at least until the age of 10, when quite suddenly his father died, leaving behind Nicolaus, his mother, and the 3 older siblings, Katrina, Barbara, and Andreas. This could have meant a severe change in fortunes for the family, if it were not for an uncle, Lucas Watson-Rode. Lucas was a prominent local figure and canon of the cathedral in Frombork, a city on the Baltic coast. He married off one of the girls, Katrina, to a wealthy merchant from Krakow, while the other, Barbara, was sent to a Cistercian convent in Kulm to become a nun. Nicolaus, however, was still young, and his brother Andreas only a couple of years older, so Lucas arranged for them to continue their schooling. Then, in 1491, at the age of 18, Nicolaus was sent to Jagiellonian University in Krakow, the first university in Poland, and Lucas's own alma mater. Records show that Lucas paid the fees in full for that year. At university, Nicolaus would have been exposed to the usual courses in natural philosophy and logic, a syllabus still heavily indebted to Aristotle. But it was also common by this time to receive instruction in mathematics, and we know he attended lectures on Euclid's Elements. Astronomy would also have been part of the curriculum, and Jagiellonian University was unusual in having not 1 but 2 professors of astronomy. The instruction he received was likely fairly basic, but nonetheless, his interest seems to have been stirred. In the next few years, he acquired several books on astronomy. The first was Feuerbach's new theory of the planets, which had been reprinted several times in the 20 years since it was originally published by Regiomontanus. He also bought 2 sets of astronomical tables. The first, a new print run of the Alphonsine tables, and the second were the tables constructed by Regiomontanus in 1467 for the Hungarian king. He had both these sets of tables bound together, along with 16 blank pages on which to make notes. Copernicus never wrote much about himself, but these notes give us great insight into his inner life. Amongst the vast pages of calculations, he inscribed the words, "What could be more beautiful than the heavens, which contain all beautiful things?" Typically, these tables were used for calculating planetary positions for the purposes of astrology, but there's no evidence he used them to cast horoscopes. Instead, he seems to have been taken by the splendour of it, writing, "Among the various literary and artistic pursuits upon which the natural talents of man are nourished, I think the ones above all to be embraced concern the godlike circular movement of the world and the course of the stars, Despite this enthusiasm, Copernicus left Krakow without a degree. This was not unusual though, and doesn't seem to have disappointed his uncle. Lucas was instead in good spirits, having recently risen in the Catholic hierarchy to become Bishop of Warmia, head of the cathedral at Frombork, and a position which came with immense temporal power, ruling an area of 2,000 square miles across the northeast of Poland. When Nicolaus returned in 1495, Lucas nominated him to fill a vacant position as canon. This would be a huge boon for Nicolaus, as being a canon of the Cathedral of Frombork would provide a steady income for life. Interestingly, Lucas chose Nicolaus ahead of Andreas, despite the fact that he was 2 years younger than his brother. Andreas had also been at university in Krakow for some time, though unlike Nicolaus, his fees were not paid in full, perhaps due to a lighter course of study. It seems that Uncle Lucas recognized early the intellectual gifts of the younger man at the expense of his older brother. Despite this new role, Nicolaus wasn't permanently tied to the church and left for further study in Bologna. Canons were often allowed to leave for the purposes of study, and Nicolaus was accompanied by a fellow canon of Frombork, Fabian Lujansky. His purpose in Bologna was to study canon law, that is, the law of the church, presumably to further his career. It seems unlikely this was Nicolaus's decision, but he went willingly, as he was in no position to defy his uncle. Nevertheless, Nicolaus hadn't lost his interest in astronomy, and he took with him the books he had acquired in Krakow. In Bologna, Nicolaus would lodge with a professor of astronomy, Domenico Maria Novara. This can't have been a coincidence. Nicolaus must have been seeking out astronomical enthusiasts and been thrilled to find Domenico, the man who had met Regiomontanus in Rome towards the end of the great astronomer's life. In 1497, Nicolaus and Domenico watched the moon pass in front of the star Aldebaran, which was the first record of Nicolaus making an astronomical observation. We can surmise that most of what Nicolaus learned about observation he got from the older astronomer. Also around this time, Nicolaus first read Regiomontanus's Epitome of the Almagest. It had only recently been printed for the first time, in Venice in 1496, and would be revelatory for the young Copernicus. Inside was a thorough account of the mathematics behind Ptolemy's models, beautifully organized and presented with clear printed diagrams. It was through this book that Nicolaus first familiarized himself with the details of Ptolemy's universe, and it's easy to imagine this smart, passionate young man absorbed in this new treasure. While he studied law during the day, at night he pored over the pages and absorbed its contents. However, he must have soon realized the issues which remained with Ptolemy's project. In particular, Copernicus found the idea of the equant deeply objectionable. According to Aristotle, the planets were supposed to revolve at a uniform speed around some central point. However, in the Epitome, Nicolaus would have found that the planet's rotation was only uniform around some other point called the equant, not at the centre. This was the same objection which had stirred all of the great astronomers since Alhaitham, as it was clearly absurd from a physical perspective. He later wrote that the equant does not seem to me complete enough, nor sufficiently pleasing to the mind. When I became aware of these defects, I often pondered whether a more reasonable arrangement of circles could be found. Copernicus would devote considerable energy over the next several decades to finding this more reasonable arrangement. A few years into his stay in Bologna, he was joined by Andreas, once again following behind his younger brother. They stayed until around 1500, when they both travelled to Rome. In that year, the city was celebrating a jubilee, and thousands of pilgrims flocked to the festivities. The Renaissance had transformed Rome into the city which we know today, with its grand architecture and spectacular art. For the Jubilee, the Pope had also spent lavishly on decorations, and the two brothers from Poland must have been in awe at the scale of the celebrations. They stayed for some time while Copernicus remained busy observing the lunar eclipse on the 6th of November and lecturing on mathematical astronomy. At the end of the year, he returned to his uncle, once again without a degree. At his own request, he asked to go back to Italy, this time to study medicine, and was granted another leave. The chapter in Varmia seemed happy with the state of affairs, seeing the benefits of having a doctor in their ranks. In late 1501, he enrolled at the University of Padua. Medicine was still closely based on the teachings of Galen, though these ideas had become increasingly intertwined with astrology. Students were taught that organs were affected by different signs of the zodiac, which meant that treatments would vary depending on the time of the year. Nicolaus was, however, skeptical of astrology, and what he made of these starry connections, history does not record. Nicolaus stayed in Padua for 2 years, again leaving before graduation, but he must have felt he needed to return to Varmia with something this time, so he went to Ferrara to take his exams in canon law. In 1503, he finally graduated with a doctoral degree and would return to Poland, where he would remain for the rest of his life. At 30 years old, Nicolaus may have finally expected to settle down to life as a canon in Frombork, working to administer the running of the cathedral. But, at the request of his uncle, Copernicus instead moved into the bishop's palace around 40 miles southeast of Frombork. While the bishop was a religious leader, he also presided over sessions of the local parliament, ruling on matters related to trade and defence. Effectively, the bishop reigned as prince, representing the interests of the king. Nicolaus, working from the palace, would become part of the bishop's staff, accompanying him as he settled disputes across the diocese. He served as his secretary, and when Lucas fell ill in 1507, as his personal physician. Under the expert care of his nephew, the bishop recovered and would rule for several more years. By asking Nicolaus to the palace, it's clear that Lucas was grooming his nephew as heir. Nicolaus was family, and the bishop was trying to ensure the position remained in the family after he was gone. Since an early age, Nicolaus was consistently elevated in place of his older brother, and their uncle's preference for his successor was clear. Lucas did eventually make Andreas a canon, though several years after his younger brother. During these years, there's little record of Andreas's whereabouts, though it appears he did not join his brother and uncle in the palace. Despite the clear encouragement from his uncle to follow in his footsteps, Nicolaus maintained his other interests. In 1504, he observed a conjunction of the superior planets, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. This is an exceedingly rare event, but also an excellent opportunity to check the motions against those predicted by Ptolemy. He found that Mars was running a couple of degrees ahead of predictions, while Saturn was just under 2 degrees behind. Like Regiomontanus before him, Copernicus was coming to recognize these small inconsistencies between what Ptolemy predicted and what he observed with his own eyes. During this period, Copernicus also learnt Greek. While 200 years prior, William of Moerbeke was the only Latin who could read Greek, it was now becoming increasingly common across Europe. During the Renaissance, a new movement of scholars called the Humanists translated antique literature into Latin, but there was also interest in reading Greek works in their original form. For his own part, Copernicus wanted to be able to read Greek astronomical work. In particular, he wished to read the Greek calendar so that he could better determine the dates of ancient observations. To this end, Copernicus translated letters by a Greek, Theophylactus, who lived in Constantinople in around the 7th century. These were moral fables and contained no scientific content, but were a means for Copernicus to practice his understanding of Greek. He had these translations published in 1509, becoming the first work he would publish in his lifetime. Around this time, however, Nicolaus left the bishop's palace. It's possible this was simply because he was required to oversee matters elsewhere, but more likely he left as it was becoming clear to his uncle he had no intention of succeeding him. Nicolaus stopped accompanying his uncle on diplomatic missions and moved to Frombork to take up residence near the cathedral. His uncle must have found it inexplicable that Nicolaus would turn his back on such a powerful and sought-after position. However, what he didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Nicolaus felt he was on the verge of something very great. During his years in the palace, Nicolaus had become disillusioned with Ptolemy's geocentric models. In particular, he noted two long-standing observations which prompted his new research. Firstly, it had been known since ancient times that the orbits of the inferior planets, Venus and Mercury, were bounded to the Sun. Venus was never seen more than 47 degrees away from the Sun, while Mercury always appeared within 28 degrees of the Sun. Nicolaus was likely familiar with Martianus Capella's encyclopedia from the 5th century, which suggested that this was because Venus and Mercury actually orbited the Sun rather than the Earth directly. He noted this alongside a similar observation about the superior planets, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. Though these orbits aren't bounded, Copernicus noted a strange coincidence concerning the retrograde motion of these planets. Retrograde motion is the phenomena where, if viewed over the course of several nights, a planet appears to change direction against the background of fixed stars. Copernicus realized that during these retrograde motions, the planets are always on the opposite side of the sky to the Sun. Ptolemy had known this and accounted for it by fixing the periods of the epicycles and deferents so that this mostly worked out. But it didn't really explain why the Sun was always opposite the planets during retrograde motion. Copernicus turned these two observations over in his mind while he was reading his copy of the Epitome of the Almagest. In the latter part of the Almagest, Ptolemy had briefly considered alternative models for the planets, and Regiomontanus had elaborated on this. In the Almagest, planets moved along smaller epicycles, which orbited around larger deferents. However, Regiomontanus showed that under a simple transformation, these models could be flipped, so that the smaller orbit came first, with the larger one moving around it. A clue to Copernicus's thinking is provided by his notes, made on the pages between the astronomical tables he had purchased years before. They show he played around with the idea of changing the scales of the epicycle and deferent. He found that if he shrank down the deference of the planets so that they were all the same size, he could fix it so that the Sun was always at the same point. Effectively, in this new model, each of the planets orbited the Sun, which in turn orbited the Earth. This model wasn't entirely new. As mentioned, Martianus Capella had considered something similar for the inferior planets, Mercury and Venus, except now it was all of the planets orbiting the Sun. However, this arrangement was really quite awkward. The orbits of the planets around the Sun would have overlapped with the orbit of the Sun and Earth. If Copernicus ever took this model seriously, then it must have been a great concern. Copernicus followed later Islamic astronomers, believing that astronomical models should represent physical reality, rather than merely being a tool for calculation. He was also strongly inclined towards a harmonious cosmos, which must have dissuaded him from this ugly compromise. Nevertheless, it was progress, and he must have been turning these ideas over in his mind when he finally left the bishop's service. In 1510, Copernicus moved out of the palace and took up residency in Frombork, finally undertaking his duties as canon of the cathedral. He was provided a 3-story house, with 2 servants, on top of his usual allowance. This was pleasant, but Nicolaus would also have been kept exceptionally busy with cathedral duties over the next few years, taking much time away from astronomy. During this period, however, Copernicus would meet a man who would become a lifelong friend. Tiedemann Gies was a fellow canon at the cathedral and the wealthy son of a merchant family from Danzig. Unlike Copernicus, Gies was in holy orders and destined for an important place in the church. But the two men seem to have shared a similar temperament, as well as an interest in astronomy. Though he was far from Copernicus's peer, it must have been nice for Nicolaus to have someone to discuss his ideas with. And it's almost certain that when Copernicus made his final leap to a heliocentric universe, Gies was the first person he told. When he actually made this leap is still a matter of conjecture. His notes demonstrate that he'd been considering it for a while, but the first time he definitively set out the heliocentric model was in a work known as the Commentariolus, or Little Commentary. In the Little Commentary, Copernicus described all known astronomical phenomena as a consequence of 3 separate motions of the Earth. Firstly, he stated that the Earth rotated once about its axis every 24 hours, explaining day and night. The axis itself also moved, which explained the slow drift of the stars' positions over the course of the centuries, that is, the precession of the equinoxes. Finally, he placed the Sun fixed at the centre, while the Earth and the other planets orbited outside. Playing with his model from years earlier, Copernicus noted that by fixing the Sun at the centre, the distance between the Sun and the planets was easily found. Using the Earth-Sun distance as a yardstick, he calculated the orbital radius of each planet, a calculation which happens to be within a few % of the true value. He also noticed that the orbital period of these planets was linked to their distance from the Sun, so that as the distance increased, the time it takes to orbit also increased. In Ptolemy's models, there was a great deal of ambiguity around these values, and some astronomers were still arguing about the order of the planets. By contrast, in Copernicus's new system, these values just seemed to drop out of the model, and the link between the distance and the orbital period became clear. When Copernicus examined this new system, he found that everything fell naturally into place. It explained why, for example, Mercury and Venus were always seen close to the Sun. This was because their orbits are closer to the Sun than our own, meaning that from our perspective, they always appear near the Sun. It also explained the phenomena of retrograde motion. Copernicus thought it was curious that retrograde motion always seemed to occur at around the time the Sun was on the opposite side of the sky to the planet. In Copernicus's new heliocentric model, the explanation for this was simple. It was just a consequence of the relative motion of the Earth and the other planets. Take, for example, one of the superior planets, say Mars. According to this new model, Mars has a wider orbit than Earth and travels around the Sun more slowly, which means around every 26 months, the Earth will pass Mars along its orbit around the Sun. From our perspective on Earth, it appears that Mars is moving backwards, whereas really, we're just overtaking it. Imagine, for example, driving in the fast lane of a motorway. As you pass slower vehicles, they seem to move backwards. This revelation also explained why the Sun was always on the opposite side of the planet during retrogression. When the Earth overtakes Mars, the Sun is naturally going to be on the opposite side of the planet. You can see how the combination of these results convinced Copernicus of his heliocentric model. The problem, of course, was convincing everyone else. The little commentary was in fact never published. Copernicus wrote a single copy, probably between 1510 and 1514, which was sent to some unknown correspondent. We know that this was then copied at least a handful of other times, likely making a small stir amongst enthusiasts. However, very few people read it, and even after Copernicus's eventual triumph, the work became lost, only being rediscovered in the late 19th century. Why did Copernicus decide not to publish? We can't know for sure. The little commentary was testing the waters, and we have no record of how it was received. But it seems ultimately he wasn't confident enough to publish. Copernicus was asking people to believe that the earth beneath their feet, which seemed so still, was actually moving. He also challenged two of the most esteemed figures of antiquity, Ptolemy and Aristotle, as well as potentially causing religious controversy. The Bible made several references to a motionless earth, and it was impossible to know how religious authorities might take the idea of a moving earth. He was also likely not entirely satisfied with what he had achieved so far. The little commentary was something like Feuerbach's new theory of the planets, in that it gave an outline of the system without giving all of the details. If he was going to challenge Ptolemy, he would need to write something like the Almagest. Copernicus knew, for example, that for the models to fit, he would need to retain some of Ptolemy's epicycles. To make this work, he would have to calculate the speed, radius, and centre of each of these epicycles, and fit them to the observations. This was a daunting task, requiring painstaking calculations of hundreds of numerical parameters. It would also likely mean that he would need to take further observations to build and check his models. His life, however, would change drastically over the next few years. In 1512, 2 years after leaving his service, his uncle, Lucas Watzenrode, the Bishop of Warmia, died. Copernicus did not attempt to succeed him. Instead, his old school friend Fabian Lujansky would be elected unanimously as the new bishop by his fellow canons. Tiedman-Gies was chosen to conduct negotiations with the Vatican necessary to confirm this. These should have been a formality. However, the King of Poland had his own preferred candidate and objected, causing months of wrangling. A compromise was eventually reached, and the canons pledged a new oath to the king, giving him final right of approval over all future candidate selections. One canon, however, was not there to pledge their loyalty. Andreas, Copernicus's older brother, had contracted leprosy. He was released from his duties at the cathedral and left Frombork, travelling to Italy. He would die alone in Rome a few years later, far from his native Poland and far from his brother. Copernicus carried on, though his duties at the cathedral were becoming a larger draw on his time. As canon, he would spend his days collecting and calculating rents, while he continued his astronomical observations at night. Whispers of his new theories made their way through the astronomical community, and his friend Tiedman-Gies would continue to provide encouragement. But, for the time being, he published nothing, and this would remain true until 30 years later, when quite unexpectedly, he received a knock at his door.